so the project's called Better Managing Fires and Their Impacts for Koala Conservation. I'll introduce the aims of the project and I guess the motivation for the project. I'm going to talk a little bit then about just the conceptual basis for the project, conceptual framework, and then I'll hand over to Pablo to talk about some of the key recommendations that come out of this project. So koalas live in in habitats like this across eastern and southern Australia. These are eucalypt dominated habitats. They're really naturally fire prone, and fire has shaped the evolution and the structure of these habitats for thousands of years. And so fire is really a natural part of these ecosystems, and is a critical component of the ecosystem as well. So that's sort of, I guess, one dimension of fire in terms of when you're thinking about koalas. The other dimension of fire is this, and this is a photo, one of Dan's photos from Port Stephens in the mid-1990s, showing a dead koala after a burn, quite high severity canopy burn. And as you can see, fires can be devastating for koalas, and we've all seen images like this from the 2019 and 2020 bushfires, and so fires have detrimental impacts for koalas as well, through things like increased mortality. So on top of this, with potential changes in climate over the next decades, we may expect to see more intense and more severe fires occurring. And so I guess it's within this sort of context of fire being a sort of natural part of the ecosystem, but also this risk that we could have these much more high intensity fires in the coming decades, and this project really sits and sort of really, how do we deal with that? So this work was funded through the NESP Threatened Species Hub, and it was part of a package from the Commonwealth Government to fund research on threatened species and fire, and this is a small part of that funding. This was a 6-month project, and clearly motivated by those 2019, 2020 bushfires, and started to think about what could we do about fire and how do we manage that for koalas in this case. And also against this background of expected increase in fire frequency and severity, whereby that's considered a real threat to koalas going forward. I should point out that fire is one threat to koalas. There are a large number of other threats: land clearing, dog attack, vehicle collisions, and so on, disease. And so fire is one of these. And as you'll see in the conceptualization of fire, that actually fire interacts with these other threats. So really, we can't treat fire in isolation. It's got to be considered more holistically around these other threats as well. And I guess the third point here is that motivates the study is really although there's quite a bit of work on fire impacts on koalas and fire management, there hasn't really been a synthesis of those of our understanding and what the potential management options might be from that. And so we've aimed to try and do some of that as well. And you'll see there's still a lot of gaps, and there's a lot we still don't know. So what were the project aims? Well, I guess one overarching aim was really to do this synthesis of the literature, and really to also develop a conceptual model of the impact of fires on koala populations, and what the potential management options might arise from that, thinking broadly across the different types of management options and how they interlink. And then also to really assess, at least qualitatively, the effectiveness of alternative fire management options, with the aim of how would you develop fire management to achieve long-term koala persistence, and then to use that to really make recommendations for better managing fires for koalas to inform at least the implementation and the development of the national recovery plan. So that's really the aims of the overarching project. Okay, so just quickly, you know, what approach did we use? Well, a lot of it was really about synthesizing and reviewing existing literature. So Pablo did most of the work around that. So he's done a really good job of trying to pull that literature together, looking at fire impacts on koalas and koala habitat. So that was a really big part of this this project. But this was complemented by trying to bring experts together to inform that process as well. So we ran 2 expert workshops. We did one in Queensland and one in New South Wales. So bringing together experts in fire, koala ecology, fire management, government policy, and so on. So the idea of those was to present preliminary components of the framework and then improve that with expert input into that process. And then also, input and review from state and Commonwealth governments as we went along through a steering committee. So that was really our sort of broad approach. And as I said, it's largely a qualitative approach, and really trying to synthesize existing information in a qualitative way. So what I'm going to do is just present so out of this work came a conceptual model. The idea of this conceptual model was really to try to bring together our understanding of the components of the system, so koala populations and impacts on koala populations, and how fire fits into that system. And conceptual models help to clarify the components of a system that are important, and in this case helps develop more concrete ideas around how do particular management actions impact on components of that system. So I'm just going to run through the conceptual model. If you want the more detail, it's in the report, and I'll give you a link to the report at the end. But the conceptual model is focused really around this idea of, I don't know whether you can see my pointer, but I'm going to try and point. Can people see that pointer? I guess you can. Yeah. So I hope you can. So really, we're interested in maximizing the probability of persistence of koalas, and this really depends on births of koalas, immigration, and emigration from sites. So if you've got a site, the number of koalas coming in and out also influences whether that population will persist at a site. And we're representing links between these as positive and negative effects. So there's a positive arrow. It's a positive association between the two. So higher birth rates leads to greater persistence of koala populations. So where does wildfire sit in this? So we've characterized wildfire in terms of extent, frequency, and severity here. And wildfires can impact on koalas through increasing deaths, so this arrow here, but also can impact this other important component, which we felt was important, was how quickly habitat recovers post-fire. So higher severity of fires can impact negatively on the ability for habitat to recover post-fire. But recovery post-fire, rapid recovery of post-fire, of habitat post-fire leads to increased outcomes for koalas through reduced deaths and increased birth rate. So that's sort of one pathway through which wildfire can impact on the probability of persistence of koala populations. But wildfires also and koala populations interact with climate, so likely increase in heat waves and drought will likely have negative impacts on koalas through births and deaths, but also impact the chance for rainfall post-fire. So we identified that rainfall post-fire is likely an important driver of how quickly habitat recovers. So if you get a lot of rainfall post-fire, then you get a good chance that habitat can recover post-fire. So climate may reduce that ability for habitat to recover. So potentially having a double whammy, but also increases the chance of wildfires or extreme wildfires and severity. Okay. But the habitat status before fire also matters. So if it's highly connected, high quality habitat, it's more likely to be potentially resilient or in terms of its ability to recover post fire. But also connectivity may influence wildfires and the extent, particularly through things like connectivity. And so there's some uncertainty there, I think, but there is a connection between the configuration of landscapes and connectivity and the behavior of fire. But these also interact with other threats, so that also impact the status of the koala population. So things like dog attacks, vehicle collision disease, and also habitat loss also interact with this process through those threats. So treating wildfires, we shouldn't really be treating wildfires or fire on its own, but considering it in conjunction with these other threats as well. So this is sort of, this is the basis of our sort of conceptual model of the system. And then we can start to overlay how potential management, fire management, interacts with this. So, one typical fire management strategy is prescribed burning. So prescribed burning is we hypothesize is positive, has a positive association with habitat status. So good prescribed burning regimes enhance habitat quality and also potentially reduce wildfire severity. But we also know, and we had a lot of debate around this in the workshops, is what is the effect of prescribed burning on koalas? And there's some evidence that it can cause things like koala mortalities. And so we've got this link here, but it's dotted because there's a lot of uncertainty around that. So that's really one area where we're really lots of uncertainty. But this sort of shows how the effect of prescribed burning might interact with these components. Another clear fire management strategy is a post-fire strategy with rehabilitation and release of injured koalas. And so this interacts with this death component by trying to reduce deaths. And then the final broad class of management is really the vegetation management, which is not directly responding to fire, but how do we maintain landscapes that are conducive to maximizing resilience of landscapes and koala habitat to fire and recovery of koala populations post-fire. So things like connectivity and habitat quality are likely to be important in those cases. So that's sort of give you a bit of an overarching view of the conceptual framework which we built and which the recommendations come. Now I'm going to hand over to Pablo, who's going to talk about, give you an idea of some of the recommendations that come out of this work.
Okay, so yeah, after we generated we created the conceptual model, we wanted to identify some management actions and strategies that could help us increase the probability of persistence of the koala populations in fire-prone landscapes. So in order to do that, we identified some intermediate objectives that if achieved, that will increase the probability of persistence of koalas in these landscapes. So we identified one section of those intermediate objectives that was pre-fire, and those include maintenance of koala habitat status and population status. As Jonathan mentioned, the koala populations, the individuals have other threats that sometimes can be even more relevant for the conservation of the koalas, and taking into healthy populations that don't have these threats will have a high probability of overcoming fire events. So that's why koala population status is so important. Also the habitat, if the habitat is connected, there's enough resources, then the koalas will be able to overcome fire events with more easily. Also fire management, maintenance of appropriate fire regimes. In theory, if we were able to manage the fire regimes in a way that we avoid high intensity fires, and we maintain the characteristics of the ecosystems, of the koala habitat. Then that's useful for the koalas. But then there's a lack of we need more evidence to be able to understand the links between fire management, because there's some situations when fire management, and particularly prescribed burning, can increase fire intensity and frequency. Also, there's other objectives for fire management in the landscapes. So, particularly human safety and property protection. So there are other objectives that are there that need to be taken into account apart from koala conservation. And there's a need to identify actions that are that can be done in different setups and for different objectives at the same time. And finally, also we assess the consistency with cultural values. So in many of these landscapes, there's indigenous communities that have their own farm and land management as part of their actions that they do on their territory. So it's important to be able to have consistency with those type of fire management. So what we did is we created this diagram support tool in order to be able to go to the sections of the framework that are more useful for the user. So in the top in gray are the intermediate objectives that I already mentioned, and each of those intermediate objectives has some principles that, if met, is going to be useful for achieving these intermediate objectives. And then there's the pages on the report that you can go and have a complete understanding of those components. So I'm going to go through each of those components and have a little brief description of the management actions and strategies that we identified. But if you want to go and have there's more information in the report, so I encourage you to go and check it if you're interested. So first, maintenance of koala population status. So as Jonathan mentioned, there's other threats that are in the landscapes that in some circumstances can be as relevant or even more irrelevant than fire. So mitigating these threats, it's really important to have healthy koala populations that can be able to overcome fire in fire events. So these are some of those other threats are vehicle collisions, dog attacks, disease, habitat loss. Then another aspect action that is needed is long-term monitoring of the status of the koala populations in the landscapes, particularly before and after fire. There's a need for more information on how is the movement and the migration of the koalas during and after fire. Do they leave? Do they stay? Are the ones that the koalas that are seen after fire events individuals that are migrating from other places, or are the ones that survived? Also, we identified that identifying important koala populations in the landscape, it's important. So which are the populations that are healthy and are thriving, and there's reproduction rates that are good and migrating to other places, and where are the koala populations that are at risk, the ones that are not connected, which probably will have a higher probability of being impacted by fire. Then it is maintenance of koala habitat status that is in relation to the characteristics of the habitat that are needed to maintain koala populations and to be more resilient to fire events. So one of the actions that we identified was restoring koala habitat. So restoring is not only reforestation or replanting, but also weed management and pest control. For example, we identified that some introduced weeds can increase the fuel load in the ecosystems. So it's important to try to remove those weeds. Also, restoration of habitat connectivity in the landscape so that koalas can move through the landscape matrix. But the other thing that we identified is that that it has to be done in a way that that fire spread is not increased. So that's something that has to be taken into account. Assessment of habitat quality and fire history. This in relation to know which conservation actions should be taken in which scenarios. So, for example, if some places has a high fire history that is with a lot of fires to time, then it has a high risk probably of having fires, and those places should be assessed to try to increase the connectivity and maybe do restoration. And the ones that have lower fire risk and the high habitat quality should be protected. And long-term monitoring of the koala habitat and the connectivity, particularly after fire events, to see what are the characteristics of the habitat that make the have a higher resilience or to fire events, or a faster time to go back to what was the original ecosystem, and to maintaining healthy koala populations. Then there is maintenance of appropriate fire regimes. In relation to these, there's still a lot of there's a need for more research and evidence to understand the interaction between fire management, particularly prescribed burning, and koala conservation and koala habitat conservation. So in theory, if prescribed burning is done properly, then that will help reduce the fire intensity and the frequency, and also maintain the status and the characteristics of the habitat. But then there's also evidence that show that in some circumstances this is not happening. So there's a need for more research in these aspects. Then another action that was identified was applying mosaic burning. Mosaic burning is a technique that can be applied in different circumstances, and that increases the heterogeneity of the environment, and also allows the habitat to be not burned all at the same time, which increases the probability of the koalas persisting in the landscape. And in some circumstances, if possible, if the koalas are present and if there's a high risk of high intensity fires, then trying to look for alternatives apart from prescribed burning, it's recommended if possible. But then in circumstances when fire management is needed, and especially prescribed burning is needed, then we identified other actions that can be done in order to increase the probability of the koalas to survive to those fires. So initially, we'll look for koalas on the area, and sniffing dogs is it's a good option to do this if it's possible. Then assessing the vegetation flammability in the area. It's important to know if the fire can become of high intensity, and particularly if it can burn the canopy, because in those situations there's a high risk of koalas of getting burned. But again, if it's possible to do apply other techniques different from prescribed burning, then it's always better, because the risk of affecting koalas is lower. So manual fuel reduction is another alternative, not only as a different alternative, but as part of the the prescribed burning, doing it before the prescribed burning in order to have lower intensity fires. Then also wetting down around the trees, the base of the trees that are used by koalas or that are known to be used for shelter or for food, or where there are koalas. And then consider the timing of the burning in order to avoid burning in time periods where there's breeding or koala migration. So if it's possible to avoid doing fire prescribed burning in those moments is recommended. Then is consistency with land tenure objectives. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's other objectives in the landscapes that sometimes are more important than or are as important as koala conservation, like human safety and property protection. So in order to be able to generate some actions for koala conservation, it's important to create spaces with the stakeholders in the area. To be able to come with some actions that can be useful for in different circumstances. And through the workshops, we found that this was very useful because in many cases, for example, the terminology is different, and sometimes some stakeholders that are doing fire management for human protection or human safety or property protection don't necessarily know which are the actions that can help koala conservation. So that's another thing, doing joint training between different stakeholders. And as I mentioned in the past, doing mosaic burning, which is a technique that can be applied in many circumstances and is good for koala conservation. And then there's consistency with cultural values. So we didn't have enough time to do indigenous engagement, so this will be something that will be needed in future iterations of this project. But some things that we found based on the literature that was available was that it's important to create spaces to exchange information with the indigenous communities. Not only to exchange the information, but also to build trust with the local communities, which have a lot of knowledge on the management of the land, have done fire management for a long time. Then after there's trust, partnerships can be created, and then there can be an exchange of knowledge to improve the fire management in the areas. And then there's the second component of intermediate objectives, that is the post-fire component. In relation to this post-fire component, we identified two sections. One that is short-term post-fire, so actions that you have to take immediately after a fire event, and then long-term ones. So the short-terms that we identified was doing patrolling to identify if there's injured koalas in the areas. Then our thing that will help to acquire more knowledge of what is happening to the koala populations and the habitat after fire is reporting the mortality and the health of the koalas after fire events, and it's sharing this information with the local stakeholders. That will help help understand which characteristics of fires make them more risky for koala populations. The same for koala habitat. Try to understand in which circumstances the habitat is more prone to have to be deteriorated, or in which characteristics make it more prone to be highly burned. And another thing that we found is that provision of food and water can be very useful for koalas after fire. There's evidence that showed that koalas drink water when there's when it's available, and probably that will help them survive these moments of after fire. And then rehabilitation of koalas, it's really important, and it's really important that that rehabilitation is done as soon as possible, because there's evidence that show that the longer that it takes for an individual to be rehabilitated, the lower the probability that it survives when it's released again into the habitat. And then in relation to long-term rehabilitation and release that I just mentioned, restoration of koala habitat so that the individuals can have more probability of finding sources of food after the fire events, and connecting with other populations and other areas with suitable habitat. Connectivity, again, this connectivity has to be done in a way that doesn't promote the spread of fire. And then something that is really important is to monitor the status of the koala populations and the habitat after fire events. And I already mentioned that in another section. And yeah, and I think I'll pass to Jonathan now.
Pablo, if you just go to that last slide, I can finish off. So yes, thanks, Pablo. That was great. So I was just going to end with just finishing on some conclusions and recommendations, and then we'll go into some questions and discussion. And so I think our experience from this project is really one of the take-home messages is that the fire impacts on koalas is really complex, and it's not, and in our recommendations we're trying not to be too prescriptive, because each case is different, and it's very hard to develop a sort of framework that's one size that one size fits all. That doesn't really happen, and and there's also a lot of uncertainties. Okay, so I think each situation needs to be examined on its own merits, rather than some broad brush recommendations, because often we're dealing with management actions that have pluses and minuses. So we're looking at trying to understand the net effect. But I think what our framework does, it really provides a way to think more clearly about the role of fire in conserving koala populations, how it interacts with other processes, and tries to identify the key things that we need to think about when developing management strategies around fire for conserving koala populations. But it's very clear that there's lots of key uncertainties. So the one I mentioned earlier about uncertainty about the impact of prescribed burning, and I know Tanya's mentioned that she's involved in a project looking at sort of cultural burning and impacts on koalas. So these sorts of studies are really important, and that's one of example of these uncertainties. So I really think we need long-term monitoring and research to really try and resolve these uncertainties if we're really going to be able to make definitive recommendations around how we should manage fire in the context of koalas. So I do think there's definitely scope to develop this framework further, especially through the implementation of the Koala National Recovery Plan. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do that through that process. And really this is a start of being able to pull everything together. But I think there's lots more work to do in this space to improve the way we manage these sort of landscapes that are fire prone for koalas, and how we manage koala populations holistically through fire management and other threat management as well. So Pablo, do you just want to go to the last slide, and then we'll finish off. So just thank you to everyone on the team and the workshop participants for taking part in this project. It's been really fun to work on it with you, and I've learned a lot. And also, if you're interested in the report, there's a link there to the report. I think Tim put it in the chat as well. So if you want more detail, then you'll find the report there. So okay, I will finish there, and I think we'll go to some questions and discussion.